Hi, I'm Jay, and today we're going to tie a 1/8 football head calf tail jig. Stay tuned. So I'm sitting today and I'm actually tying a bunch of perch jigs using calf tail, and thought I would turn the camera on today. I'm tying on a 1/8, what I call a football head, very similar to like a bullet style head. It has a number 6 mustad hook. A lot of people have trouble using bucktail, not because it's difficult to use, but just because of the differences in the type of hair. And like this tail has a section of black, natural black on it, which some people might want that hair towards the base, for smaller jigs, and dislike the fact that, I'm buying a brown tail and it's not 100% brown. As you can see on this black tail here, I haven't used the shorter hairs. I started using this tail, I believe I was putting this 1/4 sized head and using just the longer hairs towards the end. But this is still a good tail, so these hairs, that is long enough for an 1/8 or smaller. Another example of a tail that's been used, this red tail, of course, 12 inches or so, just like the two we just showed, and it's just this one section that I have left. Nice hair, good length, and I just throw it in my drawer until I get to it. So here's a white tail that I just started using, and as you can see, I began using it up towards the center, ignoring some of this hair at the bottom. Unlike a larger jig, this is a 1/2 ball, I would place the bend of the hook almost at the very back of the jaws. But on these smaller jigs, I want a little bit of space past the point of my jaws, just so I'm not hitting the thread like so. So I don't want to break my thread prematurely. And so I know that with this size jig, if I put it in the vise towards the tip of the jaws, it'll hold it securely. And I know that what we'll do is just like the larger jigs that we've talked about tying bucktails, I use the markings on the top of my jig to help measure and make sure that from jig to jig the hair is uniform. So we're using the 2/0 thread, one, because the heads are smaller, the collar will be smaller, and you want it to be a nice pretty collar, but also the thread's a little cheaper, so we use the 2/0. So I'm looking at the hairs on this, and I would prefer to start at the very bottom of my tail, but these are a little short for what I'm doing. So I'm going to turn the tail until I find this. More than likely is the very top of the tail, and those hairs are much longer, and just like a bucktail, start as far down towards the base as possible. I'm going to find my pinch. I'm using my barber scissors. We snip our pinch. I'm going to pull out the shorter hairs and the broken hairs that are at the bottom. I can switch my grip, and I can inspect the tips. This tail is not too bad, but we still want to hand stack, so I pull out some of those longer pieces and place them back in my pinch. Some of these little short ones sticking out the side, I just pull out. So this pinch is about a 50% if I was doing 2 colors on a bucktail. Alright, so that idea. I'm measuring from my collar to just on or just a hair past this 3rd dot. That's the length I want, which is actually about the length, the body length, past the bend of the hook. Okay, so you'll get some good action from the hair. It'll have a nice proportion to the jig, and should really fish well. Now the difference with the smaller jig compared to a larger bucktail that I'm tying for walleye, being all one color, we're only putting 1 pinch on this. It doesn't matter which head. Anything below a 1/4 I would consider tying this way, because of what we're doing here is this is primarily for perch, and I usually tip these with a maggot or waxworm, something like that. Maybe a Berkeley grub. So I want to leave that hook exposed to give the bait some room. So we lock our hair on just like normal. Now I'm going to stop and move my hands just so we can see. And just like on a bucktail, there is that V, so the hair's not going to pull out once we secure everything in. The top of this hook shank is open. Now if my pinch was a little bit thicker and the hairs did wrap around to maybe the 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock positions, that's okay too. I want the hook point. I want the bend of the hook and the point to be free, because like I said, we're going to tip this with some sort of small bait. And then we've locked it on, and then we just finish the head. Again, just like on a larger bucktail, I've wrapped it up to the base of the head itself, and then I can take a few wraps back towards the center and then back to the head, again creating that cone shape and a nicely shaped collar. To finish off, again I take, I don't know, 18 inches or so of thread of a different color, fold it in half to create a loop, and place that loop right underneath my last wrap. Wraps going back towards the center of the collar and then back up to the head. Keeping tension between my hand and the collar through, no matter how I change my hands, there's always tension between the hand that's holding the thread and the collar to keep that collar nice and tight. Switch my grips and I can pull this through to finish the head. Very nice jig, and as you can see, that the bend of the hook is open, and like I said, we're going to tip that with a maggot or a waxworm, something like that. To finish this off, the collar, I'm just using lacquer thinned with mech. You can use any type of head cement, and that jig is finished. Now, just like a larger bucktail, we can do the same thing. We can add colors. Here's the same 1/8 size head. Nice white with a red tip, nice old school color. Again, I'm going to start with my 2/0 red thread and lock it on. And we're going to do a 2-color pattern. So I have a red and a white calf tail. Now, just like we've discussed tying a bucktail. I'm going to find my pinch of the darker color first. Pull out those base hairs, the short hairs, the broken hairs, the fuzz. Restack as needed. And this pinch is not necessarily a 50-50. We want to keep this somewhat sparse. Like it, we don't want to load up and cover the bend of the hook because we're going to tip this with some sort of bait. I'm going to measure this and change my grips as much as I need to walk my fingers back and forth on those hairs to get the measurement that I want. So we're looking at just a hair past that third measurement point. Switch grips. Keep this pinch very tight through the whole process. Never let up on this pinch. 1, 2, 3, 4 wraps towards the bend of the hook. 2 wraps. 2 wraps till you're in front of the 4 wraps, and then I can let it go to let everybody see. And then we're going to twist this. Just give it a push, twist it around so that red hair will be on top of the jig when you're fishing. Now we can take our pinch of white, and again just a little bit thinner than what you would be tempted to put on. Big bushy tail jigs look nice, but if you try to add bait to that, it's just not going to fish right. Your hairs are going to cover the bait. So this white tail, the hair is somewhat curly, so there's some odd short hairs that are kind of poking out all over. That's what I'm pulling out here, and it doesn't hurt. If you just see a hair that doesn't seem to match with the pinch, just pull it out. Okay. So we're going to measure against the red here. I place my left hand up just so I can see the tips of the hairs against the color of my skin. Once we're happy with our measurement, my final pinch, keep this very tight, put pressure on these hairs, compress the hairs so they're together as much as possible. So I've let go just so we can see where we're at here. I'm going to finish this collar. So I walk it up to the base of the head. I'll walk it back towards the middle, walk it back up to the head. If you want, you can check both sides. One common mistake is if the bottom wrap on the red extends a little bit towards the bend of the hook and you don't see it from the top, sometimes that sticks out. And that's a simple fix where you can just take some wraps back to right to the farthest edge of your collar to get those 2 wraps in line, and then you can bring it back up. This is a nice jig. This is perfect color. Love red and white. The white head with the red tip. You can add as many colors as you're comfortable tying onto a jig this size. Old jig tire, long gone, Jim Fallon from Homer, New York is probably the best calf tail jig tire I have ever met. Good friend of the family, and he would put 5 colors on 1/32, and they were just perfect. So So there we have this red and white jig. I'm going to finish it the same way. So in discussing the importance of this left-hand pinch, as you snip your hairs from the tail and you prepare it to put it on the hook, we will have the best possible outcome. So as I measure my hair and I get the length that I want, I'm pinching the fibers of the hair and compressing them as much as I possibly can. And in doing so, when I place this on the shank of the hook, and I'm continuing to keep this pinch very tight, as I make my locking wraps and lock this thread on, there was some pressure from the bobbin as I wrap the thread. However, because I'm also compressing the hairs as tight as they can go, the pressure from your bobbin does not have to be as heavy. Because when I let go, as the hairs try to bounce back, the threads were already wrapped on in a tight manner, even though I did not have to really pull on this. Again, we're using 2/0 thread, so if I really tried to pull on that nylon thread would just break. So again, we're going to spin these red hairs over, and for my second color again, we're going to go back to the white tail, and it's the same thing, because we want to lock these hairs on in a manner that our jig will last over the course of many fish. You know, a whole cooler full of fish we want to catch on the same jig and not have to and not be worried that they're going to be ruined just because we've caught a fish on them. So again, we're going to measure. That looks good right there. Another thing with measuring, my pinch right now is that's too long. All I did was roll my fingers forward just to change the length of those white hairs, and now I know if I grab it, now that's the size I want. So compressing this, and this is pressure, like, you know, as I'm wrapping with the bobbin, I am putting pressure on the jig. I'm putting pressure on those hair fibers, but I'm also holding the hairs so tight that when I do let them go and the hairs do try to decompress, they're locked on. It's on there good and tight. Alright, so we're going to finish this just like we did before. Love this pattern. There are jigs that are painted with powder, have a powder coating. You get all sorts of really fancy color combinations, but I gotta tell you, there's just something about the red and white. That's just a hot jig. As I mentioned with the brown jig, if the hairs do roll to the sides, 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock positions, that's okay, in just adding 1 pinch to your smaller headed jigs. And I'll show you a trick here. It's a nice technique to use, especially when you're doing things like streamers or anytime you want just one color to remain where you place it. So I want this hair to stay right on the bottom of this jig. So as the jig's in the vise, I want the hairs to remain right on the top of this hook shank. So I put my pinch in place. I'm going to lock it on with very loose wraps. I have 3 very loose wraps walking towards the bend of the hook. After my 3rd wrap, I apply pressure to my bobbin just so the spool doesn't spin. Right? So I'm locking my spool in my bobbin, and I pull straight up, and then I can finish. Now I've let go just so people can see, but if we rotate this vise, you can see how the hair did not roll at all. Remained exactly where I placed it. And that just has to do with the direction of pressure as you wrap your thread around the shank. So if I'm pushing, if I'm applying pressure with my bobbin as I'm going around the shank, it's going to tend to pull the hairs one way or another. But if I only pull straight up, those loops are compressing in a downward motion and locking things in place. Beautiful jigging, as you can see. The hairs did not roll as I wrapped it. I extended that red thread down the shank of the hook. I think that kind of attracts the fish and really gets them to strike. This was a very informal sit down. If you have any questions or comments, you want me to elaborate on any specifics, go ahead and put those comments down below. I most certainly will respond to those. If you like what we did here today, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss any new content. And until next time, tight lines.